Hey everybody, this is a piece by a German philosopher named Hans Dieter Bahr. It is from the book uh, Outlines of a Critique of Technology, edited by Phil Slater, um, which is a collection of four essays, uh, critiquing objectivist or um, views of technology as neutral, as something that are merely, tools. Tools are tools, and not do not have uh, social content laden within them. Um, so I'm gonna read the introduction to this piece, but I think yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. I'm not thinking anything. I'm actually doing the opposite of thinking. But yeah, I'm going to read the introduction to this piece by the editor, Phil Slater, before reading the actual piece. So, Introduction to Bahr. Ultimately, the attempt to construct a critique of technology on the basis of Marx's critique of political economy must face up to the question of the relationship of technology to the value form. Quote, the most abstract but also the most universal form of the bourgeois mode of production, end quote. It's from Marx's Capital. Capital, the book, offers sufficient indicators in this regard. In its initial, quote, manufacturing, handicraft-based phase, capitalism's universal law of value, quote, the rule that the labor time expended on a commodity should not exceed the amount socially necessary to produce it, end quote, asserts itself as a, quote, technical law of the process of production itself, end quote. But this, quote, technical law is vitiated to the extent that, quote, since handicraft skill is the foundation of manufacture, the mechanism of manufacture as a whole possesses no objective framework which should be independent of the workers themselves, end quote. Also from Marx's Capital. If, quote, it is machines that abolish the role of the handicraftsman as the regulating principle of social production, end quote, then the ground is prepared for theorizing machinery as the purpose-built basis of the specifically capitalist mode of production, i.e., of value in process. This is the task that Bahr sets for himself in the article below. Hans Dieter Bahr was born in Germany in 1939 and studied philosophy and literature in Berlin, Paris, and Tübingen. It was from the latter university, under the supervision of Ernst Bloch, that Bahr gained his doctorate in 1968. From 1970 to 1974, Bahr was assistant professor of the Political Institute of Berlin's Free University, and since 1975, Bahr has been full professor at the University of Bremen in the, quote, study area known as, quote, Sciences of Society, end quote, Gesellschaftswissenschaften. If you don't know, Gesellschaft is German for society, and Wissenschaft is German for science. So you can kind of, if you hear the words Gesellschaft or Wissenschaft, and maybe now you know what they mean. And the quote, Sciences of Society study area, which will become apparent from the depth and range of his article, is not restricted to the narrow intellectual horizon of Anglo-Saxon, quote, social sciences. Hans Dieter Bahr belongs to a generation of German intellectuals whose non-Soviet path to Marxism was paved in large measure by the so-called, quote, Frankfurt School. The latter's theory of technology found its most radical expression in the work of Herbert Marcuse, who argued that, quote, the specific purposes and interests of domination are not foisted upon technology, quote, subsequently, and from the outside. They enter the very construction of the technical apparatus, end quote. Amid the mad rush by all... that's from Herbert Marcuse, Negations. Amid the mad rush by all and sundry to repudiate this thesis, the, quote, Frankfurt School spawned its own, quote, fifth column in the figure of Jürgen Habermas, whose, quote, clarification ran as follows. Quote, technological rationality is neutral in the sphere of material production, where what Jürgen Habermas calls, quote, purposive rational action, end quote, is appropriate, and only becomes, quote, dangerous when extended beyond its legitimate bounds to the sphere of, quote, symbolic interaction, where the ideal is, quote, communication free of domination, end quote. Once extended to this sphere, quote, technological rationality, end quote, produces, quote, systematically distorted communication, end quote, and it is this process for which Marcuse's term, quote, one-dimensional, is well chosen, that in Habermas's estimation, quote, misled Marcuse into an indictment of technology itself. In a book entitled A Critique of, quote, political technology, a debate with Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas, Bahr entered the arena by not only siding with, but actually radicalizing the Marcusean perspective. Bahr's aim was, quote, to comprehend technological rationality and technological rationality's individual constructions in terms seemingly paradoxical of the non-political manner by which they established themselves as political domination, end quote. However, such a task is obliged to, quote, fly in the face of history. Der Geschichte ins Gesicht schlagen. And the book's real value is as a provocative, and with regard to Habermas, occasionally polemical exploration of the terms of the problem, rather than as a systematic critique of technology as such. A more constructive perspective emerged in a paper to the, quote, Technical Intelligentsia in Late Capitalism Symposium in Heidelberg in May 1971. This paper was reworked for publication 2 years later, and it is from this latter version that the following translation has been made. In the present context, Bahr's article serves two main purposes. First, to elaborate at length on the role of machinery in the real subsumption of labor under capital, and second, to identify the constitutive form behind this process as the value form. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that this article should be the most difficult and demanding of the entire volume, apart from the typically German idiosyncrasy of using etymology as an indicator of meaning, e.g., quote, uniform et, end quote, literally signifying, quote, one formness, end quote. And the more substantial problem of Bahr's predilection for Hegelian passages, the real difficulty lies in the depth of meaning that Bahr affords to value theory. Footnote: for a readily comprehensible introduction to Hegel, see W. Stace's The Philosophy of Hegel, A Systematic Exposition, published in 1955. This also includes an introduction to Kant that can be highly recommended to those who find Kapferer's resume in the previous article too condensed. End footnote. In this regard, there is no substitute for equal seriousness on the part of the reader. Footnote. The basis for any sound understanding of value theory, which is not a, quote, specialist question of, quote, economics, is a detailed study of Capital, the book, in particular the first part entitled, quote, Commodities and Money. useful light on the precise nature of what Marx is attempting here is shed by the first 2 chapters of Value, Studies by Karl Marx, which is, as I've said in other videos, is on the channel. As for the secondary literature, which should be a companion to, not a substitute for the primary text, a reader can usefully consult Isaac Illich Rubin's Essays on Marx's Theory of Value, published in Detroit, 1972, I believe translated by the anarchistic theorist Freddie Perlman, as well as Diane Elson's edited volume, Value. I don't have Essays on Marx's Theory of Value on the channel, but I do have I tried to make an audiobook of that, but it's like kind of like gets into like fucking like has like charts and shit. And once you start getting into charts and like large quantities of numbers, it just doesn't feel like it translates into an audiobook well. But maybe I'll try again someday. But I do have a piece by Isaac Illich Rubin, who was a Soviet economist murdered by the Stalinist state, on this channel. Yeah. End footnote. Indeed, one of the merits of Bahr's article, particularly at the close of the present volume, is precisely to show that the critique of technology does not simply, quote, extend value theory, but actually leads right into the heart of value theory. The Class Structure of Machinery, Notes on the Value Form, by Hans Dieter Bahr. The historical development of the means of labor, Arbeitsmittel, as the transformation through labor of nature-given forms into the socially purposive forms of the labor process is simultaneously the, quote, naturalization, end quote, of the social forms of instruments of use. Gebrauchsmittel. As a material thing, the means of labor not only mediate between nature and subject of labor, but also serve as the mediation, the, quote, means among those who carry out labor. The fact that the tool can only serve the function of mediating the living relationship among workers, if this living relationship is simultaneously severed, is the reason why, in the form of private property, it can also, quote, mediate a social relationship between workers and non-workers, or between different types of labor. If the means of labor as means of production come to mediate between the ruling and the subordinate class, they must acquire a dual social character in the course of their historical development. The means of labor are a means by which the ruling class can directly satisfy its wants. But they are also the, quote, purposive basis for perpetuating the one-sided relation between worker and non-worker. As a means, therefore, the tool not only stands between nature, history, and society, but also between different classes in society. The tool is not merely the means, but in fact the purposive basis for one-sidedly uniting the subject of labor with the subject of appropriation. Hence the genesis of the means of production, as this objective basis, is in fact the process of the mediation of two asymmetrical social subjects. Bourgeois science perceives the fact that the ensemble of means of labor results from the objectification of these dialectical forms of the living relationships of labor merely as archaeology. This follows from its method of reasoning backwards from the result, the product, to the living social formation. For example, it concludes from certain snares and fish hooks, in contrast to hunting projectiles such as spears, that a particular tribe was on the verge of stable settlement. Specific types of stone drills, requiring complex and painstaking manufacture, indicate more enduring forms of the division of labor. The once existing living form of particular social relations and structures now resides in the tangible and symptomatic form of the ensemble of nature-given materials changed by the action of social labor. That archaeology does not turn archaeology's criteria around and apply archaeology's criteria to archaeology's own material basis, but confines itself to non-bourgeois social orders, is part of archaeology's brief. There shall be no archaeology of the systems of bourgeois means of production. The developmental forms of present-day means of production are more and more mediated through scientific labor. We can specify this relationship a little more precisely by noting the following. Although it is well known that manual labor creates the means to transform nature-given forms into socially purposive forms, curiously little consideration is given to the fact that scientific labor differs from the former only in terms of the form of the means which scientific labor creates for the production of its knowledges. Even the critiques of the pure deductive sciences are in general less concerned to criticize the possibility of such scientific purity than to question its actual tenability in practice. Historically, the beginning of the deductive sciences coincided with the empirical production of tools, models, drawings, and symbols as the means for the supposedly pure, i.e. uncontradictory, expansion of knowledge. These means include rituals as collective memory, along with language, writing and mechanical printing, and numerical and data processing. Although experimental scientific equipment was a precondition for the technologization of production, experimental scientific equipment was, as Zone Rato correctly points out, not the technologization of production's active source. Neither the spinning jenny and the mechanical loom nor the steam engine arose in direct connection with either the discoveries or technical apparatus of theoretical physics. On the other hand, the pre-scientific structure of machinery, as the structure of machinery existed prior to the development of chemical techniques and the industrial application of electricity, represented a form of development which exhibited more than the, quote, personal unity of intellectual and manual labor, end quote, that Zone Rato claims for handicraft implements. As means of labor, simple mechanisms already possessed a structure which machinery, as the purposive basis of the capitalist labor process, simply made more apparent, namely the two poles of, quote, drive, power, and, quote, tool, mechanical construction, which are in turn directly mediated through the transmitting mechanism. Languages kept alive in language's concepts what now only appears in material form. For expenditure of labor power as the moving force, read drive, for skill and dexterity as the purposive essence of the social transformation of nature wrought by mental and practical activity, read tool. And the transmitting mechanism could well be interpreted as the naturalized form of intercourse among the workers themselves, or, in historical terms, the ossified form of intercourse could be interpreted as the mediation between the plebeian and peasant handicraft form of labor in which, in addition to the prevailing class antagonisms, there also lurked an incipient antithesis between the intellect and the increasing abstractness of the nascent proletariat's labor power. In this instance, the tool would correspond to the intellect, and mere driving force to the proletariat, as labor power deprived of its skill, although the mediation of the two moments, inasmuch as it still lay with the handicraft workers themselves, was direct. What this allusion is meant to indicate is that the instruments and the very basis of the scientific production of knowledge only became a condition for the development of the mechanism, via the stages of machinery and mechanization up to automation. Because the social organization of living labor conditions had already assumed a, quote, rational, i.e. mathematical form, which could therefore become the foundation for a systematic scientification, Verwissenschaftlichung, of the production processes. This mediation between scientific and proletarian labor, anticipated in handicrafts, and later to assume this mediation between scientific and proletarian labor's own independent and objective form in machinery, in turn points to a third factor underlying these two forms of activity, which, despite a historically uneven mode of appearance, constitutes from the outset the possible common factor: the immanent value form of the means of production, as, quote, abstract natural form, or as abstract social purposiveness in the ossified form of nature-given material. The following descriptions are initially intended to sketch the development of the mechanical and technological, quote, means of labor in terms of their surface appearance. This is a prerequisite for the deeper question of the development of inner form as class-determined structure and external form as instrumental shape, and of their unity as function. Sorry, 1 second. The surface appearance. The social nature of the relations of production, which, historically, only appeared in the first instance in the form of generalized exchangeability, becomes essential or real only in the living act of cooperation, where individual concrete labor is actually reduced to abstract average labor. Quote, the law of valorization, writes Marx, quote, comes fully into the law of valorization's own for the individual producer only when the individual producer produces as a capitalist and employs a number of workers simultaneously, i.e., when from the outset the individual producer sets in motion labor of a socially average character. End quote. Marx. Our emphasis, Hans-Dieter Bahr. Cooperation, which according to Marx remains the basis of industrial production, consists initially of a purely quantitative aggregation of handicraft units in which the direct means of labor remain the property of the worker. The initial form of constant capital for increasing surplus value appears as the method of attaining a merely external generalization within the existing division of labor in the workshop. However, this nevertheless takes on a qualitative dimension, such as increased scale of workshops, stores, and internal means of communication. These means, are better stated, these bases, as these bases exist in their actual shapes, must be seen as the material results of specific living relations of labor. These bases are in fact the basis for the possibility of handicraft workers being able to work together in larger groups. Elements of feudal landowner and guildmaster fuse, most noticeably in mining and mills, into a type of absolute bourgeois patriarchy over the journeyman. In cooperation, the mechanical activity of the hand in working up and structuring materials increases merely quantitatively. By contrast, manufacture breaks down aggregate labor into detailed operations, which brings about a qualitative transformation in the relation of the worker to the object of labor. Means of labor develop which increasingly reduce skill, i.e., manual dexterity, and an intellectual know-how, to the level of an abstract expenditure of force. This separation of the intellect of labor from the expenditure of labor, power, then becomes a necessary condition for the rise of the scientific technological intelligentsia. Protein shake time. The external form of a merely quantitative increase in the number of workers finds its corresponding inner form in the de-skilling of labor power as the precondition for collectively raising the abstract expenditure of force to a higher power. The, quote, body of the collective worker precedes the appearance of machines for supplying motive power. The dissolution of the inner union of the laboring subjects and their skill alters the relation between the object of labor, which is to take on a new form, and the final result of the change wrought in the material, the product. The objective is no longer a product in direct reference to the individual subject of labor, but only in relation to the individual capital. Even in quantitative cooperation, many objects of labor were simultaneously worked up alongside each other until the completion of an object of use in the hands of the master craftsman. But in manufacture, the object of labor passes through a series of stages, preparing, altering, shaping the material, which itself presupposes that the raw material can be dismembered and reconstituted, the final stage being a new assembly of the materials. However, the transmission of these partial operations, excluding chemical or electrical labor processes, remains external and indifferent to the product being created. In other words, the product does not take on their form. Transmission consists of a non-mechanical form of transport for raw materials within the workshop, together with the communication of directions and instructions. In this context, speech is not so much aimed at passing on understanding, as, quote, semi-skilled, in fact means converting understanding into manual dexterity. Rather, as long as the labor process is running smoothly, speech serves simply as a set of directions for ensuring that specific partial operations on the object of labor are always carried out in the same way, i.e., uniformly. Natural science later defined natural science's own labor process in accordance with this model, i.e., as operational and experimental. The experiment should always yield the same result under identical conditions in order to produce a, quote, valid conclusion or result on the object of research. Terminology itself here reveals the close affinity between natural scientific labor and the increasingly abstract natural form as value form. Uniform motion, which already appeared in the demands made on time measuring instruments or on static and dynamic mechanics, exemplified in construction work or in the machinery of agrarian mills, is an expression of the fact that a nature-given material marked out as, quote, analytic by the type of social labor, i.e., a material divided and dismembered by the division of labor, assumes a, quote, real value form contradicting not only its nature-given form but also its useful form. The reason is that the asserted but never realized formal equality of movements in the labor which produces commodities can be seen as the same type of equivalency of form that in the value relations appears as the equivalent form of value. This question is discussed more fully in the second section. The qualitatively new form of societation, which comes into being with manufacture, creates the living cooperative collective worker as an organically structured whole, an analytic synthesis in which what had been a merely quantitative aggregation becomes a qualitative social unity. However, the form of societation tends simultaneously to bring about the negation of the direct collective worker in the workshop, primarily through the specialization of activities and the splitting up of complex handicraft implements. The machine tool is then the first transcendence of the acute specialization, namely by combining within the machine tool's self a series of separate individual tools that they no longer require the mediation of human labor. Quote, combination here means that collective labor, the living cooperation of a number of specialized workers, disappears as such to be stored as the, quote, natural form of a higher mechanical power. The objectification of specific social relations of labor corresponds to the de-objectification of living collaborative labor. This is expressed in the antithesis between the isolated specialized worker and the technological collective worker. With the objectification of subjective labor conditions, which as the machine tool forms the purposive basis for the industrial labor process, the worker is initially reduced to the function of pure motive force. The inversion of the relation between worker and tool, through which the body's simple physical power was transformed into the stationary mechanism, driving the machine tool that actually shapes the material, leaves living labor with the cooperative organization of the internal transport of pieces of work. In this role, abstract labor power functions as the, quote, motor force, as the living transmission in addition to abstract labor power's function as a stationary motive force. In this usage, quote, living means that the object, the purposive condition, the means and the subject's purposes still constituted a simple, unspecialized unity in relation to the labor process, from which it still appeared possible to determine and realize the very aim of labor by way of anticipation. Under the conditions of the class-based separation of labor power from the means of production, quote, objectification means that although there is a workshop unity of purposive conditions, object and means of labor, and means to ends, the labor power to be valorized, the process is, quote, rational, only in the sense of, quote, mathematical, rationnel. In fact, there is a general social antagonism between the determination of the ends to which the labor is being put and the initial unity mentioned above, an antagonism which reacts upon the form of development of the conditions of production. Quote, living cannot mean a secret desire to return to handicraft activities, since handicraft labor only permitted the vague utopia that it could give rise to a social subject as subject in conjunction with artistic labor. The translation of the transmission and motive force of human beings in collaboration into, quote, natural forms is the condition for the possibility of machinery. The rise of machinery was itself only possible because decisions to the goal of labor, the production of the bourgeois class by capitalist means, remain totally external to the labor process itself as a mere functional condition. That is, as a, quote, sublated, aufgehoben, means for the, quote, simple satisfaction of needs. One social class had to be completely divorced from the final determination of ends before the social forms of labor could become more, quote, rational, i.e., quote, subjectless, and consequently assume a purposive natural form as machinery. In this form, the direct social rationale of the labor process ceased to have a subject and became irrational, although this lack of a subject is the necessary condition for the liberation of social reason from its blind natural shape. Machinery is precisely the clear proof, once the genesis of machinery's dual social form has been incorporated into the critique, that in the labor process bourgeois society exists without a real subject, and consequently confronts nature itself as a simple, quote, force of nature. This explains why the working class first had to become politically conscious, and therefore an ideal, subject, before the possibility of actualizing the social subject within the labor process could appear. At the same time, this, quote, ideality of the proletariat's existence as a subject, incorrectly posited as real by Lukács in History and Class Consciousness, also constitutes from the outset a permanent tendency towards the de-revolutionizing of the working class. Since the working class's interest in production is not since its interest in production is not produced through the working class. Sorry, I'm confused about this. I'm trying to follow the fucking pronouns. I'm getting mixed up. At the same time, this, quote, ideality of the proletariat's existence as a subject incorrectly posited as real by Lukács in History and Class Consciousness also constitutes from the outset a permanent tendency towards the de-revolutionizing of the working class, since its interest in production is not produced through the latter, but is obliged to become a political idea before it can produce its own material basis spontaneously. Quote, revisionism is therefore a significantly more serious problem than is registered in the various versions of the conspiracy theory. On the other hand, the labor process based on machinery, where the worker retreats from activities which directly give form and shape to the material, itself assumes a more, quote, ideal character. It is, as it were, offers itself to the prospect of quote, politicization from within. Expressed in technological terms, living labor actively becomes confined to assembly, which is usually located at the end of a series of machine-worked partial operations. The worker is therefore confronted by the material in a socially nature-given form, whilst the directly nature-given form turns into an aesthetic object, becomes, quote, scenery. The object, as a prospective commodity, is no longer wrested from the nature-given material or at least so it appears to the individual consciousness. Rather, elements of raw material that have already been preformed and pre-structured by a mystical subject, and which thus appear as objectively social, are constructed, assembled, fitted, inspected, and regulated. The transformation of work activity into the activity of assembly, transport, and coordination was the condition for the invasion of the engineer into industrial labor. Prior to this, the engineers had proven themselves historically in the sphere of military science and practice, the field in which bourgeois society had anticipated the generalization of production through the, quote, rationalized organization of destruction, and in particular the unilateral appropriation of social wealth, as an economic subject collecting taxes militarily. The bourgeois state formation displays this, quote, one-sided form of rationality. In contrast to the undifferentiated homogeneity of direct handicraft work on materials, the mechanical technology of construction allowed the pre-planning of coordination, transport, and assembly operations. Consequently, using machinery as its purposive basis, the production process as a whole inevitably had to change the character of work activity, which had previously had a directly determined relation to nature. Before the splitting of the production process into the production process's ideal and real components could take place, i.e. operational and technological planning on the one hand, and individual realization through physical labor on the other. This change was achieved through practical analysis and simplification, de-skilling. At the same time, planning became the inner plant price form in process, i.e. the ideal form of the measure of value, while its objectification in proletarian labor constituted the genesis of constant capital as machinery. Machinery is not therefore an application of theoretical mechanics to production. Rather, it was the development of quantitative relations out of living cooperation, which became the a priori of machinery. Hence it is the form of constant capital which constitutes the real mediation of natural science. Its operational rationality and the degree of societization of labor in the production process. The technical face of this mediation, the organic composition of capital, consists in the technologization of production. Machinery sets free an intellect formerly bound to the feudal handicraft labor process. An intellect which carries the possibility of forming a political collective worker out of the divided partial workers. In contrast to the work ethic of the guild, the political cooperation of wage workers comes into external opposition to production as such, since the social ends of production confront the proletariat as an external force, i.e. as the ruling class. The leveling down of the specialized workers by means of production, technology creates the condition for turning the wage struggle into the potential political socialization of a working class in the process of organizing that working class's self. On the other hand, the contradiction between the specialized worker and the technological intellect responsible for the direction, construction, and transmission of the isolated detail operations prevents the working class from recognizing its own social character in this intellect, which in fact represents its own intellect. The fuck? There's some serious typo here. Which in fact represents its own intellect, even if in the form of an unconsciously collective product alienated from the working class and acquiring independent shape, in the form of planners, technicians, and engineers. The proletariat therefore stands in outward opposition to the proletariat's own intellect, which the capitalist process of production has created in formal independence. In part, it was this hostility which weakened and nullified the resistance of the working class to fascism. In addition, the absence of a practical theoretical critique of the productive intellect blinkers the working class, binding the working class as a variable moment to the aggregate social capital. In this respect, the working class is merely an antagonistic, but nonetheless fixed component of bourgeois society. Its blindness towards its own but alienated intellect means that it contributes to the maintenance of the false totality of this society. And a, quote, liberation, which takes place behind the backs of the producers, posits freedom as a mere ideal. Okay, so when I was talking about a typo, there was like an abrupt ending to an abrupt interruption of one paragraph by another. I can't really explain it. It's like the sentence cut off and then another paragraph started just below it. So I'm going to read this thing that's like cutting into it, but I'm not sure where the hell it's supposed to be placed. So it says, however, this process of mediation only becomes apparent when this relation of science and industrial labor begins to turn into this relation of science and industrial labor's opposite, i.e. in the chemicalization of production, where the process changes from working up already existing materials to the creation of qualitatively new materials. At this point, the production of scientific knowledge and scientific knowledge's instruments in laboratories and planning departments begins to function as the active moment in the generalization of production, a process in which, quote, scientification is at the same time a kind of ideal societation. That is, the, quote, scientification of production becomes a fundamental moment in the power of the actual form of societation, whose other moment consists of the external forms of realizing surplus value. I feel like this might have been like a footnote, but there's no like indication anywhere that it was a footnote. I don't fucking know, so bear with me. The uniformity of the... That's the end of that paragraph, by the way. The uniformity of the partial operations as the commodity form in process within the workshop also became the condition for flow production. This initially took the material shape of industrial standards for individual pieces of work. Subsequently, in many cases, the individual factory no longer needs to produce commodities as, quote, use values for subjects. The individual parts of the product cease to possess any direct social use value and are, quote, utilizable only for the possible, but no longer necessary, assembly of individual objects into use values. This assembly is itself mediated through the capitalist market and can therefore be thwarted by crisis. Should difficulties arise in realizing the surplus value produced, these partial use values collapse into objects having no meaning. Such a contradiction encourages the formation of cartels. The standardized component part is the appropriated and objectified form of the universal exchangeability of use values, not as price, but rather as the natural form of commodity capital. Bourgeois consciousness only comes face to face with this process in the repair trade, namely as the interchangeability of components which are useless in themselves but nevertheless still commodities. With the standardization of component parts, even assembly loses the character of being a constructive activity. Complex forms of assembly line, with intervening semi-automatic machine tools, construct the object, mediating the individual operations of the production process. The need to set norms for the performance of the workforce itself dismembers the human body into abstract functions. The bodily organs defined by the logic of modern medicine themselves take on the abstract form of nature, the fully adequate substrate of the value form. Only now does the bodily organism actually become, pure value form in itself. The training of the organs for certain extremely specific functions renders the body as a whole clumsy. It loses its integral functions as the creator of use value. In addition, an ever-increasing period of formal training and retraining becomes necessary, even for unskilled workers. The one-sided expenditure of force and skill by individual limbs and sense organs destroys the functional unity of the individual's body. Individuals cease to be an instrument of use to themselves, even in work activity. At the same time, capital seeks to profit from this loss of bodily unity through, leisure activities, medicine, and sport. With the objectification of assembly work, packing, delivery, storage, and transport into machine-based mechanisms, the machinery described by Marx is reduced to a mere moment of technology, in which the industrial production process itself assumes circulative forms, just as the circulation of commodity capital is industrialized. Industrial and commercial capital fuse via the functional role played by finance capital. Nevertheless, the stage of mechanical technology remains overwhelmingly characterized by factory labor. The regional concentration of the means of production is still the basis of spontaneous forms of mass struggle, in which trade union types of organization and political groupings can, at this relatively low level of development, still overlap to a great extent. However, mass communications based on technology take on increasing significance as means for artificially resolving the, ideality of the collective worker. This also marks the beginnings of bureaucratization. Necessarily, but nonetheless incorrectly, the organized workers build up the cadre as a distinct form for their own implicitly revolutionary intellect, a form which often begins to blindly follow its particular inner contradiction of wishing to conserve the revolutionary movement without knowing how to constantly revolutionize this work of conservation. With the industrial application of electricity, traditional machinery begins to dissolve, or rather to encroach on the familial and even joint stock spheres of capitalist private property. The state, as an abstract but underlying unity, gains in significance as a particular form of the aggregate national capital. The distribution of energy, that is, of the, objective motor forces, undertaken by the state, takes on the role of providing the mutually exclusive individual capitals with their fundamental connection, a process which had already started with the nationalization of the communication, transport, and education systems. With the transfer of power generation away from most factories, machinery becomes, quote, supraplant. Machines which supply motive power grow into the independent power station. The previous network of canals, roads, and railways is expanded and extended through more, quote, ideal means of communication, such as pipelines, cables, and radio waves. In supraplant terms, the individual factory is assigned the function formerly carried out by the machine tool. Excuse me, that's a nasty burp. In contrast to the steam engine, the motor is an almost transmissionless moment in the drive of the machine tool. At the same time, the direction of the linguistic means of labor or of measurement and guidance systems in telecommunications also begins to turn into a technological form of the internal and external mediation of production, confronting the proletariat with the proletariat's own intellect of earlier collaborative labor in a totally estranged form, and hindering spontaneous and mass forms of communication. A critique of trade unions and parties has yet to make this development really clear. A task of increasing importance since the first signs of the dissolution of the massified worker into work groups, gangs, and teams can quite spontaneously lead to a renewed guild or professional type of organization rather than a class organization. Ritual allegiance to increasingly inadequate mass organizations of the working class leads on the one hand to merely, quote, representing the interests, end quote, of the commodity, labor power, and on the other, to the further provincialization of the proletariat. This process is further encouraged by capitalist urban construction, with the rapid industrial urbanization of the countryside, the real social growth of towns as it began at the end of the 19th century can itself stagnate as mere, quote, sprawl. The development of high and low voltage engineering meant that principles of production, extension of surplus labor time through reduction in necessary labor time, in this instance being that necessary to reproduce the wage, could also seize hold of the sphere of the reproduction of labor power. The technologization of domestic labor not only released the labor power of the woman, but above all allowed the indirect extension of the working day, as the long time workers spend traveling is unpaid. In general, the wages of the worker no longer cover the reproduction cost of domestic labor power. Should a member of the family become unfit for work, state welfare has to intervene. Unbelievable physical misery is caused by the fact that capital has clearly destroyed the communication among members of a traditional small group, even if, as the family, this was a simple outgrowth of nature, and yet has artificially and formally kept this group together through the activities of state capital and the capital of the construction sector. The reverse side of the technological objectification of social powers is that living relationships, including even affective and sexual relationships, can only be conveyed and interpreted in mechanical terms. High and low voltage technology offers the clearest proof of the problem which arises when production is generalized solely through these processes of objectification. Workers' councils in those places where workers also possess political power as a class can be both a first step in the reunification of consumption and production, work, need, and interest consciously constituting society, as well as a form in which the contradictions within the social division of labor, beyond the individual factory, can be spontaneously solidify into competition within the working class. This in turn necessarily produces a bureaucratic centralization which dictates an external cohesion to such self-managed units. A counter-tendency to the process of division and subdivision in the sphere of mechanical technology can be found in the machine tool and vehicle building industries, although its principal field of operation is those branches which undertake the chemical processing of raw materials, or where chemical techniques are introduced into other branches of production. Whereas the activity of forming and structuring materials first acquired objective structure via mechanization, in its broadest sense, only in a few rare instances could changes in the inner forms of raw materials be obtained through the mechanical expenditure of human force. As a consequence, those processes which change and transform materials underwent a much lower degree of decomposition into individual part operations than those which shaped matter, and the tendency to relegate the mechanical aspect itself to a subordinate intermediate moment of production arose here much earlier. Moreover, it developed less out of the nature of the tool than out of the necessity of isolating people from certain phases of chemical transformation. For this reason, the monopolization of capital found a favorable, quote, natural form here, since in terms of the outlay on constant capital, there was a high raw material intensity of production, i.e. a rapid turnover of circulating capital relative to the small amount of value transferred from the fixed capital. It's kind of difficult to explain here, but by circulating capital and fixed capital, what is meant here is like circulating capital would be like means of production. I think it's like in the technical like definition of it in like capital is something to the effect. This is discussed in I believe Capital Volume 2. Circulating capital is capital whose value is transferred to the product immediately upon its consumption, and fixed capital is capital whose value enters into the commodity at the end of the production process, only in increments over time. So, for instance, say you had like a an instance for example, like to use like very primitive understanding of this, a piece of fixed capital, to my understanding, maybe I'm not remembering this correctly, would be like a knife, right? Say you spend $10 of a knife on a knife. The value represented in $10 would transfer over time into the value of all of the commodities that the wear and tear on that knife went into. That would be fixed capital. Circulating capital would be like, say you were a butcher, and you had meat to cut, or maybe that's not a good example. Say you had an onion. When you're using that onion, and the value of that, the pre-existing value of that is automatically transferred will be transferred to the value of the product of the commodity being produced. So maybe a better thing would be like, say you were a taxi driver or something like that, or like you were an independent person. I don't really know how Uber works exactly, but say you were just like a person who drove people in cars. An instance of circulating capital would be the gasoline that you put into the car. You're instantly consuming the gasoline in the production process of producing a relocation of people. That value would immediately be consumed. The car that is going into it, whose value would be transferred to myriad different rides over a period of time, would be fixed capital. So fixed capital is generally associated with things like machines, but I think it's because it's talking about how value is transferred to products. I think it's a little more broader than merely machines. Anyway, since in many instances it was the scientific analysis of the inner characteristics of natural substances which first made new materials possible, the laboratory soon became an integral part of the chemical industry. Scientification not only of the means of labor, but of the object of labor itself was, to an even greater extent than in the electrical industry, an absolute priority. Many processes could only be carried out automatically. In the chemical industry, particular moments of mechanical technology became the characteristic basis. The, quote, drive mechanism was necessary, partly for processing the material, but also as an inner moment in the actual process of chemical bonding. In contrast, transmission mechanisms and tool elements fused into one, as in the elements for lift, drive, and bonding, and in parts such as pipes and storage systems through which materials flow. The characteristic abolition of the differences between object and means of labor is already evident in the internal parts of the steam engine, for the flow of steam and gases, as indeed it is in all forms of equipment in which physical, chemical, and biological processes are combined. The synthesis of object and means of labor finally revealed that the means of production are no longer a means for the workers, that they are no longer their, quote, instruments, but simply the autonomous purposive basis for specific forms of labor, in which the form of activity producing use values begins to diverge from the form creating value. The autonomization of the process of valorization, such that it produces its own structures of labor, which can only yield use value through the mediation of the market, expresses itself, quote, ideally, in the tendency towards the fusion of a nation's capitals into a quasi-state organization for administering the totality of social life. In this sense, the fascist, quote, folk community, end quote, Volksgemeinschaft, was not only an ideology, but also a real integration of large sections of society into the slave-like organization of the conditions for valorization. An integration that in part was accomplished in total disregard of the actual class divisions. The characteristic feature of technochemical production methods is not so much machinery itself, but the thoroughgoing union of machine and apparatus. The assembly process takes a back seat to the activity of measuring and regulating the continuous flow of a production linked by pipes, fed by storage reservoirs, and united through the reactions which subject the material to chemical change, alongside the mechanical forms which transport the commodity object as the commodity object comes into being. In contrast to the historical forms of changing raw materials, e.g. smelting, In chemical production, the various forms of motion and their transformations, together with the means, skill, and object of labor, are fused in a manner which can no longer be seen as the result of a spontaneous logic of cooperative work relationships, as is still the case with labor based on machinery. In this instance, the material form taken on by the intellect in the framework of production is no longer the alienated intellect of the proletariat, its ability to work and organize, but rather the outcome of deliberate scientification. The scientific intellect does not therefore have a merely alienated proletarian origin, such that it could be reclaimed, but is indifferent to working class consciousness from the outset. In contrast to the alienated proletarian intellect of engineers and mechanics, the intellect of the laboratory scientist is haute bourgeois, or high bourgeois, in origin, even if this difference itself tends to break down through the growing industrialization of scientific and technological work. In other words, the scientific division of labor is leading to dequalification of scientific work. Once numerical and data processing has passed through a corresponding development, giving rise to a fixed structure of partial operations in scientific activity, the qualifications of the scientist will almost totally lose their current form of the scientist's own quasi-handicraft private property. Research and discovery will be possible without real control over private property in the, quote, means of thought. The proletarianization of the scientific intelligentsia will then only be delayed through wage differentials and privileges. The step from mechanization via regulation to automation could, for precisely this reason, contain the possibility of bringing the proletarian and scientific intellects together, not by the student or academic intelligentsia taking on an inherent proletarian character, but through a genuine critique of the politico-economic structures of scientific and technological forms of understanding. This involves not merely a critique of the ruling class, but also, in fact, primarily a critique of, quote, objective technical dictates, end quote. The universal social pressure for efficient performance exerted by capital in the frozen form of the perpetuation of its class-determined division of labor. The contradiction to the rapid change in the capitalist division of labor, which simultaneously retains class-specific occupations, i.e. technical change in the division of labor, but social fixing of the asymmetrical distribution of types of labor, appears in technical terms as the separation between the material and organizational aspect of production, and in social terms as the irrational drive for constant retraining, needed to maintain strict separation of the training of the mind from the occupational application of previously acquired but now redundant skills. Class structures should therefore be sought not only in the form of the ruling agents of the bourgeoisie, but also in the technically veiled forms of labor, and their corresponding training in an abstract, subjectless logic of production. This logic is the source of that attitude which rejects domination in subjective terms, but at the same time accepts domination in subjective terms in the form of expertise and objective necessity, e.g. in technological and terminological constraints, in the abstract drive for productivity, and in bureaucratic and administrative exigencies, but chiefly in the destruction of people's ability to communicate and address each other in libidinous and emotive ways. These objective class pressures secure the persistence of traditional forms of bourgeois life and are able in turn to outlive the actual capitalist mode of production without undermining the basic structure of bourgeois society, i.e. the value form. In order to be able to assess this society's essential nature, it is necessary to turn from the phenomenal aspect of the means, objects and conditions of the production processes, to the fundamental structure reproduced therein, namely the dual social form of the commodity objects, a form which reveals their class character. Form as identification. It is difficult to evaluate the developmental forms of machinery since these forms produce their own fetishism. For example, on the surface, no real distinction can be made between suitability, Zweckgemäßheit, which can be possessed by the characteristics of natural materials, although the actual use, Zweck, is a matter of complete indifference to them, only impinging upon them negatively or in Hegelian terms as, quote, absolute susceptibility, and purposiveness. Zweckmäßigkeit. The notion of, quote, suitability is meant to express the indirect relation of a thing to the purposes of society. Quote, purposive, by contrast, denotes a direct relation. Whereas nature remains an external moment to the aim for which it is appropriated, technology is always, quote, internal to the aim, i.e. functionally appropriate. As a means, technology is accommodated and tailored to the ends. The purposive object may have, quote, natural material as an underlying substrate. However, this figures in forms that must in general be regarded as, quote, technology, that is, as a, quote, purely social creation. If the, quote, material, or, quote, matter, expresses the form of nature in itself, then the, quote, content expresses the form produced, characterized by and characterizing the material. Footnote. Quote, matter contains form locked up within matter, and is absolute susceptibility to form. ... Matter must therefore be formed, and form must materialize itself, must give itself in matter self-identity or subsistence, end quote. G.W.F. Hegel, Science of Logic, end footnote. Machinery is nature in suitable form, i.e. the natural materials offer the natural materials forms, as it were, so that, quote, nature-given form can become form for something else, namely social requirements. Sheer nature-given form dissolves and becomes the ground for social form. On the other hand, quote, machinery is purposiveness, created and produced by human beings, and to this extent its form is a purely social product since it cannot be found in nature. And yet, this form must simultaneously be available in nature, since the social form of purposiveness must be expressed in a suitable natural material. Otherwise, it would remain sheer want, unfulfilled human need. To this extent, an electrically driven lathe for cutting threads is a, quote, nature-given form based on natural characteristics. However, this unity is not maintained. The cutter becomes worn during use, i.e. the nature-given form forcibly asserts itself against the nature-given form's purposive social form as soon as the machine, as purposive basis, itself, quote, produces use values. the cutter also becomes obsolescent, i.e., the cutter's social form can, under certain quite specific social relations of production, assert itself forcibly against the former unity of suitable and purposive form. In this case, the inner structure, as objective social form, shatters the external unity, which we shall term the technologically superseded shape of an indirect use value. The machine, which in itself is contradictory, can only possess the unity of dual social form and nature-given form through its functioning and in the historical form of its development. And yet, the byproduct of the latter is precisely the breakup of this unity. The shortcoming of these observations is that a number of factors had to be introduced and posited externally. Marx himself bemoaned the lack of a rigorous history of technology, which, in contrast to the abstract materialism of the natural sciences, would have presented the genesis of the active relation between human beings and nature. Such a history is still lacking, which explains why the real historical movement and the generation of relations of form cannot simultaneously provide us with the coining of their concepts. Marx was most sensitive to this gap on the question of the genesis of constant capital, where Marx was repeatedly obliged to assume certain forms of the instruments of use in the production process. Up to now, machinery as result, as purposive instrument of use for the production of objects of use, has always been abstractly counterposed, in critiques of technology, to machinery as constant capital for the simple utilization of labor power and the extension of surplus labor time. This has been so despite the fact that the two aspects develop in a real unity that arises and passes. To forestall any conceptual confusion, we should note that as a, quote, means, Mittel, namely means of labor, machinery is simply, quote, a means for producing surplus value, end quote. Machinery is not a, quote, means in the sense of a use value for the creation of use value, since the, quote, mean term, or, quote, mediation, Vermittlung, is precisely the laboring subject, which alone can organize and set, quote, means in motion to attain ends, and not the machinery itself. The latter simply provides the purposive basis for this mediation. What exists as, quote, means for capital is simply the purposive basic condition as far as the labor process is concerned. On the other hand, for capital too, machinery figures as the purposive condition for extending the working day. And for the social labor process, machinery is in turn a, quote, means for creating use values. Yet it is only for the subject who determines end purposes that machinery is truly a means, namely for the unilateral appropriation of objects of use. Meanwhile, to the workers, machinery is simply the abstract basis for the realization of alien ends, in order to maintain their own existence. Hence, machinery is not only characterized by the dual character of nature given in social form. Its social form, too, has a dual character, which we term, quote, class structure. As a social form, it has the shape of a suitable means for appropriating surplus labor. To this extent, machinery is only machinery when in uninterrupted motion. On the other hand, it has the abstract shape which only asserts itself indirectly through an inversion of the means-end relationship, of a purposive condition for producing use values whenever called upon to produce use values by social requirements. In this form, which asserts itself more deviously, machinery would be machinery only when not directly in motion, but merely available for use at any time. That distinguishing these two social forms of machinery is not mere hair-splitting is, quote, proven in any crisis of overproduction, where each form works forcibly against the other. The historical development of machinery has not only taken place within the contradiction between natural and social form. In addition, class society produces a dual contradictory social form of machinery as value and as instrument of use. Under the conditions of commodity production, the inner structure of machinery as nature-given form develops simultaneously as both a form of use value and a form of value. The value form must therefore be, quote, visible as one of its moments. Thus machinery, quote, at rest, does not express machinery's character of availability on demand, as in the case of an empty road, but will always be the result either of machinery's natural and historical wear, or the recoil effect of a crisis of overproduction. It is therefore precisely that side of machinery's social form that makes it a means for satisfying social needs which, under the conditions of the capitalist world market, serves to reflect possible economic crises. One of the effects of the atrophy of Marx's critique of political economy into, quote, Marxist economics has been that insufficient attention is paid to the social form of use value qua means of labor. Not only, in Zohn Ratel's appropriate formulation, has Marxism remained idealist vis-a-vis the natural sciences, but more so and with more serious consequences as regards the conceptual treatment of technology. Marxism has remained idealist. The fact that Marxism has remained idealist vis-a-vis the conceptual treatment of technology applies in particular to the means of production, which the political economist always views in the same light as that in which they were planned and designed by the engineer, i.e. purely instrumentally. However, a, quote, pure instrument, i.e. an instrument unrelated to any specific purposes, would merely be an aesthetic object and not an instrument at all. It would be nothing more than abstract functioning. And this is precisely the value form and process, frozen into a nature-given form. As far as the engineer is concerned, machinery, as a blueprint, wears out neither naturally nor socially. It appears neither as a means of production of surplus value nor as the possible basis of a crisis of overproduction. The engineer considers only the most abstract form of its purposiveness. It must, quote, work. But at the same time, the engineer is oblivious to the fact that this very conception corresponds exactly to the value form of the intended machinery. As we have already mentioned, there is no direct cause-effect relation between machinery as nature-given form, as instrument of use and in the form of constant capital, since the change in form is affected by different subjects. The question is, what mediates these different mutually contradictory forms, and where is the ground within which we can locate these mutually contradictory forms determining characteristic? As Marx only gave a brief examination of this possibility of an interconnection of different characteristic forms, we intend to follow up and emphasize this connection. In a contribution to the critique of political economy, where this question is more prominent, Marx writes, quote, use value as an aspect of the commodity coincides with the physical, palpable existence of the commodity, end quote. However, they can only, quote, coincide in the result because they have first to be differentiated and then reunited in the process of labor. But even as a finished object, available for sale or exchange, the commodity requires a specific form of mediation between the commodity's use value as the simple unity of nature-given form and purposive form, and the commodity's possible exchange value. Marx succinctly designated this form of mediation as the, quote, sensuous measures, end quote, of commodity objects. Measures, massa, are quantitative relations, such as numbered items, spatial extension, and weight, as social qualities of objects. Viewed historically, measures are for the most part elements of previously valid specific measures of value, quote, particular equivalent forms, end quote, which were unable, for a variety of reasons, to evolve further into the general form of value. So, for example, scales in conjunction with the standardized poundal, kilopond, as possible equivalent represent, as it were, an uncompleted development towards the money form. Not all objects as possible commodities could be weighed. Nevertheless, the iron weight retained the iron weight's social, quote, standardization, the iron weight's particular equivalent form as a unit of measure, enabling relative value magnitude to appear in a completely abstract form, namely as the expression of a quantum of labor time, in the first place. Measures constitute the quantitatively distinguishable qualities of commodity objects as sheer amounts, number, length, area, space, and weight. For the most part, these commodity measures are only, quote, relations in themselves. The determinations of measurement rarely confront the commodities in reality. The sale of commodities means that commodities already ideally possess their particular measure as amounts, since price is the form of the commodity's equalization with those measures. The appearance of the magnitude of value as relative, quantitatively determined value form expresses the fact that the magnitude of value appears in the particular relations of the commodity's measures. 5 bushels of wheat are worth 2 yards of cloth, i.e., a specified amount of specific volume units of wheat are made equal to a specified amount of specific area units of cloth. The commodity form thus accomplishes the paradox of equalizing relations of measurement, which are utterly different socially. Volume equals area. Furthermore, it is only in such relations of measurement that the magnitude of value appears at all. They are its specific form. Although the poundal itself only allows an abstract type of value equality, tied to the nature-given form of the object, e.g. corn and wine but not cattle and wheat, where the measure of weight is impracticable as a basis for equalization, the development of the value form itself creates social forms of things that make possible the development of the price form of commodities. The value of a commodity always appears in the heterogeneous relation of 2 unit measures of specified amount. The equalization of different amounts therefore creates the form of the common element underlying this relation. a time-measured magnitude representing a quantum of labor. The form in question is the value form. This also applies once commodities cease being exchanged and are bought and sold. One unit of measurement is hidden in the price form. The former measures in weight of gold as the, quote, standard of price. The other unit of measurement is hidden in the expression of the amount of the commodity which has received its price. This relation is expressed somewhat unclearly in Marx's notion of the, quote, natural form, which becomes the value form of precisely that commodity whose natural form it is not. If, quote, natural form is understood as the social unit of a nature-given form and useful form, the concept is spot on. However, if, quote, natural form is understood solely in terms of the nature-given aspects of the object of use or commodity object, the expression is incorrect, since the value form is reflected in the unity, expressed as amount and measure, of nature-given form and useful form. Only thus is it possible to appreciate the way in which the fetishism of the commodity is brought to completion. There is nothing mysterious in the fact that people, quote, reify or objectify their living relations in the process of, quote, socializing properties of nature. I shall therefore retain the distinction of nature-given form, Naturform, and useful form, Gebrauch form, and employ the notion of, quote, natural form, natural form, to express their negative unity. This is because the determinate amounts of commodities, i.e. amounts which could only be, quote, determined by recourse to units of measurement in the first place, are relational forms that are as, quote, purely social, as is the form of the magnitude of value in its visible shape as the money form of commodities. Initially, commodities are produced, not as definite measures, which, like volume, for example, usually originate in the sphere of consumption, the practical circumstances of the use of various objects, but rather as indeterminate amounts, Mengen. It is only the determination of value which requires already existing quantities It is only the determination of value which requires already existing characteristics to become the quality of specific quantitative forms, i.e. to become measures. Weights, spatial areas, and numbers which through unit measures become a definite measure magnitude, first arise as intelligible forms of commodity objects in the value relation itself. Prior to this, even in production, the, quote, sensuous measures are merely indeterminate amounts of products, i.e. simple magnitudes. Clearly, the nature-given forms remain the abstract, but not completely indeterminate phenomenal substrate of the commodity measures. Commodities are produced in definite amounts, in the form of a quantitative determinacy which makes it possible to exchange and buy commodities as, quote, measured amounts. In the conscious production of values characteristic of capitalism, these intelligible forms of the commodity, quote, intelligible, because these forms, like the price form, only exist through the, quote, understanding of symbols, not through the sensuous perception of qualities, become forms of the commodity object, quote, within production. The operational planning of production expresses this through the fact that it no longer produces amounts in general, but, based on experience in the market, has to produce more or less precisely specified amounts. And since the division of labor means that the output of the factory no longer constitutes a complete use value, but rather a fragment of a use value requiring the mediation of the market, these elements must assume measures which guarantee that they can be, repeatedly, assembled into a complete use value. The basis of these measures of the product lies in the, quote, sensuous measures of the commodity. Hence the determination of the amounts of commodities no longer takes place during exchange or sale, but is produced along with the commodity from the outset. These determinations enter into the plant-level development of new forms of use value. In the course of bourgeois society's development, use values, produced as commodities, assume different forms, namely inner value forms. The object of use no longer corresponds merely to an appropriate relation between nature-given form and form for social need, i.e., purposive form. In addition, the object of use must, as a commodity, take on a second social form to render the object, quote, purposive, for exchange, for circulation as commodity capital, and for the value relation in general. The foundations of this commodity purposiveness were the, quote, sensuous measures, commodities as qualitative amounts. These measures are now basic to all technical and scientific research activities and theoretical constructions. Certain areas, in particular electrical and chemical technology, require the invention of new units of measurement, most of which referred back in an analogous and comparative way to older geometrical and mechanical measures. The unification of such measures plays an important role in the further development of capitalist relations of production, as can be seen in Britain's current conversion to metric standards. These units of measurement are also the condition for the possibility of unitary industrial standards, which can be regarded as units of measurement attached to technically specific nature-given forms of commodities as inner value forms. Historically, this commodity purposiveness becomes the basis for, quote, rationalization, not only in the creation of industrial standards, but also in work organization. The concept of rationalization reveals what lies at the core of bourgeois value rationality, namely, as the logical, seemingly uncontradictory thought form of valorization's pure functioning. Presumably, it was this characteristic form of technological rationality, sinking down from the value relation to the actual production of commodities, that first struck Zoon Rachel, but which Zoon Rachel could only interpret as a, quote, reflection of the commodity form in consciousness. To summarize, the nature-given material of the commodity object must assume a purposive form not only for use but also for exchange. In turn, this latter form functions blindly as the condition for the possibility of more, quote, rational forms, i.e. plays a part within production by co-determining the further development of adequate use value forms for the products. The, quote, uniform motion of machinery itself accommodated the creation of a, quote, inner value form of the commodity objects as mutually equal, just as machine motion itself expresses the, quote, inner value form of the means of production as process. The equivalency, or here it's like valency. It's like kind of like hyphen. There's a hyphen in the middle of the way it's put in the text, so I'll try to say it that way. Equivalency of the various commodities amounts becomes their actual equality. The fact that these distinctions of form are no mere hair-splitting is shown in all those conflicts which arise between product planners and technicians on the one hand, and the factory's purchase and sales department on the other. In my opinion, the dual social form necessarily assumed by the commodity provides us with a genetic explanation of abstract categorial thought forms that has more of a foundation in reality than Zohn-Ratel's arguments can have. Zohn-Ratel's arguments are ambiguous. On the one hand, thought forms, quote, arise from acts of exchange, a point which merely leaves us with an unanswered riddle. On the other hand, Zohn-Ratel interpolates an unspecified act of reflection between thought form and commodity form. Yet the reflection of one form in another medium presupposes that very understanding which pairs the real and reflected forms with one another in order to arrive at a judgment as to their formal identity. Certain forms of the social intellect are just as much products as determining moments of the universalization of value. They cannot be conceived either as merely, quote, presupposed, as in shelling, or as simply, quote, derived, as in empiricism to which Zohn-Ratel in the final analysis belongs. The amount of the commodity can only express that amount's self as quantitatively determined value relation if these determinate amounts assume a peculiar additional nature-given form, either a very abstract form like weight or extension, or a readily intelligible form like number, and thereby become determinable relations of measurement, which are in turn the preconditions of the appearance of value. By becoming measures, the amount of the commodity is abstract vis-a-vis the direct form of use value, but conditions the specific historical, quote, identification of the directly natural use form of commodities and their value form. Without the activity of the understanding, the ideal form of the measure of value qua price form could neither develop nor persist. A specific aspect of the understanding turns into a moment of the value form and becomes one, but only one, of the constitutive preconditions of money and hence of capital. Otherwise, one could never speak of the commodity's value objectivity as, quote, sensuously supersensuous, end quote. Sinnlich übers Innerlich. Footnote. For this Marxian formulation, see footnote number 3 to Norbert Kapferer's article in the present volume. As is well known, Marx demarcated, quote, social existence from consciousness in terms of the material basis and what derived from the material basis. If one then conflates, quote, consciousness and thought, a hostility to theory can develop which, although distancing itself from supposed, quote, idealisms, in fact constitutes the very basis for idealism's independent existence. Only the most minute part of the development and activity of social understanding is, quote, conscious, although it is this understanding as a whole which differentiates social from merely natural, quote, existence. In turn, consciousness is the dependent term vis-a-vis the understanding. The former's relatively small role in social determination characterizes the specific blindness of reason in social development. End footnote. For the remainder, we shall further narrow down the problem to the commodity objects in the commodity objects' capacity as material elements in the immediate production process. Here, Marx specifies the results of the genetic form mentioned above. Marx formulates the dual social form in terms of the unity of means of production and, quote, means of valorization, end quote, i.e., constant capital encompassed within the concept of the means of production. We have already stated that this dual social form, structure and shape in the process of their mutual exclusion and identification as function, was the precondition for developing, quote, means of labor, which are no longer means for the worker but means for valorization, i.e., merely the purposive condition for the utilization of a social unit of labor power or of labor power qua social. Machinery now possesses use-value form only in relation to society in the abstract, as capital. Concretely, in relation to the individual worker, it only has the one-sidedly abstract social form of being, quote, value in itself. It has the form of simple, quote, value for the production of things which somehow have utility. In the consciousness of the workers, quote, value becomes established as a scarcely differentiated contradictory unity of use value and abstract value. To say the machine has, quote, value means that the machine has a significance, a validity, as a relation of labor and as a, quote, ware. Gut. Although still unclear, proletarian consciousness reveals an understanding of the fundamental distinction between the two social forms of machinery. Witness the history of machine wrecking. However, it is for the political understanding of the proletariat to posit the specific meanings of each so as on the one hand to be able to theoretically, quote, reconstruct machinery in machinery's role of a, quote, useful object for the production of useful objects, and on the other, to thereby be able to grasp machinery as capitalist private property for the extraction of surplus value. Since machinery, and even more so, apparatuses and technologies as nature-given forms, have in various occupations forfeited their elementary sensuousness, i.e., their character as means of labor. Their meaning cannot be grasped through perception, but only through an abstract political understanding, qua critique of those relations. The socially determined dual form existing as machinery, or as means of production in general, causes certain structures of the class-based division of labor to become frozen, where others are revolutionized in general. It mediates the unequal types of social labor and maintains them in such a way that, quote, plant rationality, the mathematical division of labor within the factory, constitutes the irrationality of the individual's labor. It is sheer chance whether an individual labors with no opportunity for communication, or whether there may still be a limited possibility for developing an interest in changes in working conditions and work tasks. In general, quote, interest, as such, is banished to the pure sphere of reproduction. The logic of the technological development of labor is employed against the direct needs of the proletariat as working individuals. This can be seen from an empirical study. For example, how automation is introduced in precisely those areas of production which are in fact the least stupefying. Only as a whole, in abstract totality, does reason blindly assert reason's self in the, quote, increase of the constant constituent of capital at the expense of capital's variable constituent, end quote, i.e. in the one-sided, subjectless alteration in the technical composition of capital. Only the, quote, subjectification of the material foundations of social production would mean the creation of a social subject. The second, abstractly social aspect of form as the means of production's inner value form is the active aspect. The aspect of the means of production as directly useful can only assert itself in opposition to the latter. The dual social form of the object in production is hence the, quote, ground of this society in two ways. First, machinery is the basis of the dominance of one class over another. It establishes the proletariat as such. Second, machinery is the basis of the societization of labor processes precisely by virtue of the development of a, quote, inner value form of the means of production. This is the locus of the rationality of the social structure of production, through which direct forms of use value are destroyed and the mediation is no longer effected through the spontaneous agency of the individual, but through society in general. Hence, machinery and technology establish the developing existence of society as a subject, in the sense of the requisite level of the productive forces. However, in contrast to Marx's own period, this dual basis no longer asserts this dual basis's self through a spontaneous mediation of classes. Rather, this process of mediation of classes is itself a product of the scientific and technical intellect. The, quote, scientifically arranged process of production, end quote, must be investigated in terms of this, quote, arrangement. It is no use merely presupposing this intellect as mysteriously antecedent to capital, and then confirming that the results of scientific and technological research are appropriate and used by capital. This does not explain the specific form of development of that intellect. As Grossman's critique of Burke indicates, at the surface level, it is not so much that the deductive form of thought sets the deductive form of thought stamp on mechanics, the basic form of machinery, as the other way around. Mechanisms and mechanical dynamic structures stamp on the specifically deductive form of thought by supplying the understanding, in sensuous terms, with the abstract, naturo-analytic form as its material, as the content of formal thought. The, quote, whole is given a priori, albeit in a social form which simultaneously provides the, quote, knowledge that the whole is analytic, in the sense that the apparatus, say a mechanism or gear system, is previously assembled from parts. Theoretical deduction presupposes practical mechanical synthesis. Fundamental principles are given, not merely as, quote, intuition, but as conclusive, quote, evidence. At the same time, in the functioning of the mechanical works, the system should be constructed, quote, free of contradictions. On the other hand, should the functioning cease, then deduction directly becomes theoretical analysis, theoretische Analytik, i.e. if repair work is initiated, or further development is undertaken on forms of use which have ceased or appear to have ceased to be purposive. The empirical analytic form of thought, conceived in philosophy, for example, as the prior intelligibility of perception and intuition, presupposes deduction as a, quote, functioning whole, just as deduction presupposes practical active analysis, i.e. division of labor. However, it is not until they become an element in the capitalist production of commodities that logical necessity and certainty, as requisites of the functioning of mechanics, are stripped of their character of mere need, mere want. Although the system of gears and mechanisms may previously have been more or less purposive to labor, in capitalist production, the system of gears and mechanisms functioning becomes an absolute necessity, and repair or crisis is inevitably the contradiction and shortcoming and loss of profit. Consequently, the dual social form of the mechanical means of production is first expressed in the category of, quote, regularity, but in advanced commodity production as, quote, causality, i.e. the necessary coercive relation of cause and effect. Traditional logic anticipated technologic, just as commercial capital anticipated industrial capital. The technical relations which are developed, not merely reflected, in the social understanding, materially as the functional nexus in machinery and technology, of use form and value form, finally obtain an autonomous subjective form for the mediation of capital and labor in the shape of the technical intelligentsia. On the other hand, this autonomy is in turn the presupposition for the dual social form to set the dual social form stamp on the nature-given form of, quote, brain. As a moment of use value, the intellect is tied to matter. As deductive discursive logic, its material production of knowledge achieves an abstract independence, expressed in institutional terms as training at the levels of primary, technical, and higher education. At the same time, this is the presupposition for industrialization of the social dissemination of the knowledge required for production and for the production of knowledge itself, i.e., it is the presupposition for the separation of the means of thought. Laboratories, libraries, data processing machines, etc., and thought power, Denkkraft, itself. It is the signal for the real societation of the understanding, which, under the conditions of bourgeois society, can only be achieved via the detour of the dequalification of individual thinking, i.e., via the manufactured stultification and artificial stupefaction of those layers of the intelligentsia which used to be the creators and carriers of culture. Doubts that human development will survive this passage through the, quote, de-utopianization of life as a precondition for life's brutalization generally are too widespread to be written off just as an ideology of bourgeois downfall based on cultural pessimism. This is why it is all the more important to recognize the class dictates, which become interest-free and sublimated in the technological division of labor, for the structure that they really are, namely, quote, the inner value form of things, end quote. However, in contrast to ideology, the fetish character of the, quote, inner form of in contrast to ideology, the fetish character of the, quote, inner value form of the means of production is necessary for their continuing development, analogous to the way in which the results of mathematical operations often have to disappear in the resultant formula before the latter can provide the basis for more complex relations to be calculated. And precisely because the genesis of technological development must disappear in the result, proletarian consciousness hardens into a false ahistorical immediacy. The illusion develops that the individual tool, machine, apparatus, in fact the entire technology of the production process, is always a means, always an instrument which in itself anyone can appropriate and use. The weapon or tool appears to have the same form, in terms of structure and shape, in the hands of the oppressed, as the weapon or tool does in the hands of the oppressor, although the goals may have changed dramatically. The functioning, mediating instrument seems completely indifferent to the mediating instruments two extremes, bourgeois private property and proletarian labor. Although in the final analysis it is this mediation alone that can link the two classes, since in the long run sheer political military force is not an adequate basis for maintaining social cohesion in a system of production. This is the source of the increasingly revolutionary role of the scientific technical intelligentsia as the subjective side of this fateful mediation of classes. This scientific technical intelligentsia both co-founds the link between classes, as well as having the scientific technical intelligentsia's own existence within this mediation between classes. The reason why the surface appearance of the means of production is dominated by the semblance of indifference is to be found in the fact that in industrial production, the living dialectic of the material interaction with nature is no longer experienced, if for no other reason that, so far as the workers are concerned, the means used to work upon nature-given material are simply the conditions of their abstract activity. The construction of particular plows and looms revealed both the social existence of the peasant and handicraft workers of a particular historical epoch as class-specific occupations, as well as the basis and degree of societization of this agrarian and handicraft form of production. The class, as an occupational estate, existed simultaneously in the natural form of its means of labor. It was only with the separation of the worker from the means of production, the mediation of this development of the constantly evolving means of production to the worker, via the activity of the intellect, that the means of labor assumed a historical form which no longer corresponded to the individual's activity. The paradox is that although machinery and technology were created as the purposive basis of bourgeois class rule, machinery and technology appear as their opposite in the social mediation of individual capitals through the market. That is, they appear as a neutral, indifferent basis for the societization of the production process through the division of labor. They appear specifically, quote, class neutral, particularly in comparison to objects from the sphere of consumption, where cars, home furnishings, and fancy packaging and buildings still directly exhibit both forms of their social nature, namely utility and domination. By contrast, the highest stage of the developmental forms of the means of production, as, quote, rationality of the inner value form, end quote, produces the opposite appearance. The melancholic sameness of proletarian working conditions vaunts itself as the, quote, transcendence of class society, end quote. For the simple reason that capital, as, quote, inner social value form of the means of production, end quote, presents itself abstractly as the means of production's societal nature, I'm fucking this up. By contrast, the highest stage of the developmental forms of the means of production as, quote, rationality of the inner value form, end quote, produces the opposite appearance. The melancholic sameness of proletarian working conditions vaunts itself as the, quote, transcendence of class society. For the simple reason that capital, as, quote, inner social value form of the means of production, end quote, presents itself abstractly as the latter's societal nature and universal validity, in fact, a society in itself, taking on material shape as the universally valid coercion characterizing labor conditions. This novel semblance may be the reason why there has been no machine wrecking in the 20th century, even though the same class relations of production are manifested, albeit in a subjectless form, in this system of machinery and technology. Machine wrecking has today turned into machine wrecking's opposite, quote, machineolatry. The critique of the genesis of these socially dual class-specific characteristic forms now has the task of calling the mechanisms of this fetishism by their real name. Translated by Pete Burgess. Thanks for listening.